conservation room at the Mississippi Department of Archives smells like beeswax, old linen, and something faintly chemical that never completely leaves the air, no matter how many times the ventilation system cycles through the building overnight. Margaret Cole had worked in that room for 11 years. She had rebound 314 volumes. She had touched documents that were 2 centuries old, handled letters written by men who owned other men, pressed her gloved fingers against paper that bore the weight of the entire American catastrophe without breaking. She was not prepared for volume number 212. The blade went into the spine at the standard 40-degree angle. Controlled pressure. A clean entry. She had done this motion so many times, her hands no longer required instructions from her brain. The coverboard separated cleanly from the text block, right along the line of deteriorated adhesive, and she set it to her left. She reached for the rounded spatula. She inserted it along the inner hinge. The tool stopped. Not resistance from warped board, not a pocket of stiffened glue. Paper, folded, deliberate, compressed flat under 145 years of accumulated weight. Her tool had found the edge of something that had no business being there. She set the spatula down. She used her fingers. 11 folds, 22 surfaces. She unfolded it under the light table. The paper was dense, fine, clearly cut from something larger with a sharp blade and a straight edge, and it was covered. Every millimeter of usable surface, covered in numbers, column after column of figures, written in a hand so even and so controlled and so patient that Margaret Cole's first thought was that it had been printed somehow by a machine she didn't recognize. No words, no names, no dates written in letters, nothing that could be called language by the people who had made those words illegal. Just figures, pure, relentless, perfect figures. She sat down on the floor of the conservation room. She did not call anyone for 26 minutes. There were 15 more ledgers in the same collection. Natchez, Mississippi, sits on a bluff above the river. In 1843, it was one of the wealthiest cities in the United States. Wealthier per capita, some historians argue, than anywhere in the industrializing North. The bluff was lined with houses that took years to build and required dozens of human beings to maintain. The source of that wealth was not complicated. It grew in the fields below. It was harvested by hand and carried to the river and loaded onto boats. The boats carried it to mills. The mills turned it into the fabric that clothed an expanding empire, and the empire sent the money back up the river to the bluff, where it became houses and silver and portraits and ledgers. The ledgers were essential. Cotton was a business. Business required accounting. The Hargrove plantation covered 640 acres. It sat 12 miles outside the city on ground that had been cleared by hand over the course of 1 decade at the cost of years of human life. The official records show consistent production. The county assessor's figures show consistent yields. The tax records show consistent and accurate compliance with the requirements of Adams County. Not one of those records is accurate. 127 people lived on that land. They appear in the plantation's official inventory documents as a single aggregated figure. Hands, field, and house, 127, valued per attached schedule. The attached schedule assigned dollar amounts, ages, descriptions of physical capability. Not one of those 127 people had the legal right to own the paper their names were written on. They built everything that exists. They are documented as tools. One of them kept better books than the man who owned him. He appears in the plantation ledger as 3 words: Ezra, house accounts. No surname, no age, no birth date, no assessed value, which was anomalous because enslaved people were property, and property required valuation for insurance and estate purposes. The absence of a dollar figure next to Ezra's name was not an oversight. It was a decision. One single line in an 1851 letter from Thomas Hargrove to his brother in Vicksburg explains it without meaning to. The accounts man does figures only, cannot be taught letters. Serviceable, nonetheless. Serviceable. That was the word Thomas Hargrove used for a man who was running the financial architecture of a 640-acre operation. Serviceable. Ezra could not read or write letters. This was not a limitation the plantation had caused. It was a limitation the law had deliberately constructed, enforced across the entire state with criminal penalties. Teaching an enslaved person to read was illegal in Mississippi. The law had closed the door on language. Ezra had walked through a window they didn't know existed. Numbers had no law. Numbers did not require permission. Numbers did not require a teacher or a book or a lamp burning at night over a hidden page. Numbers were the only system of record in that house that no one had thought to prohibit, because no one had imagined that an enslaved man would use them to tell the truth. The plantation's official bookkeeping operated in 2 columns. The left column recorded raw inputs, labor hours logged by field overseers, seed costs, equipment maintenance, water usage, transport fees. The right column recorded outputs, bales per acre, lint weight per bale, market price per pound, total seasonal revenue. Thomas Hargrove reviewed both columns quarterly. The county assessor reviewed them annually. The figures were clean, consistent, and completely falsified. The left column systematically undercounted labor hours by an average of 31%. The right column understated seasonal yield by an average of 18%. The mechanism was not subtle. It was simply never examined because the people with the authority to examine it had no reason to doubt a white landowner's account of his own productivity. The discrepancy generated by those 2 falsifications had a specific purpose. It reduced the plantation's taxable yield. It reduced the assessed value of the estate. It increased the net profit that flowed directly to Thomas Hargrove's personal account by a figure that, across the 16 years Ezra worked in the house accounts room, amounted to approximately $290,000 in period value. Someone was watching. Someone was counting. The someone could not speak about what he counted, so he folded it. The folding method has no name in any historical record. Archivists at the Mississippi Department of Archives call it the Natchez fold. Informally, in the way that professionals name things when they cannot believe the thing in front of them is real. It works like this. A single sheet of fine quality paper, cut to precise dimensions from a larger piece, is folded 11 times in a specific alternating sequence. 3 horizontal, 2 vertical, 3 horizontal, 2 vertical, 1 horizontal, producing 22 compressible surfaces with a combined thickness, when pressed under weight, of approximately 4 millimeters. 4 millimeters. The exact depth of a standard leather spine's inner channel. The folded document, pressed inside a freshly glued spine before the adhesive set, became structurally identical to the packing material used in standard 19th century bookbinding. It had the same give under pressure. It had the same response to heat. It was invisible to the hand that ran along the outside of the cover and felt nothing unusual, because there was nothing unusual to feel, just leather and glue and the compressed history of 127 people's working lives, folded into the shape of silence. Thomas Hargrove reviewed every ledger annually. He ran his hand along every cover. He turned every page. He saw 2 columns. He never opened a spine. The first entry in Ezra's hidden record is dated March 1843. The figures are written at the top of the first folded surface in the same hand that appears throughout all 16 years. Controlled, minimal, using a system of shorthand notation that required 3 months for a forensic accountant hired by the Tulane University research team to fully decode. Each enslaved worker appears as a 2-digit assigned number rather than a name. Hours are recorded in quarter-day increments. Yield is recorded in pounds, not bales, a distinction that matters enormously because bale weights were among the most commonly manipulated figures in plantation accounting since no standard bale weight existed, and overseers routinely inflated or deflated them according to need. Ezra recorded in pounds. He had access to the weighing scales. He knew the actual numbers. The column he added, the third column, the hidden one, recorded the difference. Every quarter day of labor that Hargrove's overseer failed to log, every pound of cotton that disappeared between the field scale and the final tally, every figure that Thomas Hargrove moved from the visible record to his personal account, under the assumption that no one was watching, that no one was capable of watching, that the man sitting at the accounts table in the corner of the house office was a calculator rather than a witness. Ezra was watching. Ezra had been watching from the first day they sat him down at that table and put numbers in front of him and discovered that the numbers came back correct. He watched for 16 years. To understand what 16 years means in this context, you have to understand what every year cost him. Each year ended with a new ledger. Each new ledger required a new hidden sheet. Each hidden sheet required access to fine paper, the kind used for house correspondence, stored in a locked cabinet in the main office, to which Ezra had a key because he was the accounts man and the accounts man needed paper, and the thought that he might use paper for any purpose other than accounting never occurred to anyone, because the thought that Ezra was using accounting for any purpose other than serving Thomas Hargrove had never occurred to anyone. Each year required the cutting, the folding, the 11 folds in sequence, from memory without a pattern to reference. Each year required inserting the folded sheet into the spine of the new ledger before the binding adhesive set, a window of approximately 40 minutes, during which the glue remained workable. Ezra bound his own ledgers. This was not unusual. Plantation accounts men were expected to be functionally self-sufficient. No one thought to supervise a man doing a task they had assigned him to do. 40 minutes, every year, for 16 years. If the overseer had walked through the door during any one of those 40-minute windows and asked to see what Ezra was doing, Ezra would have been standing at a workbench with a folded sheet of paper that contained 16 years of documented proof of systematic fraud. Proof that implicated not just Thomas Hargrove, but the county assessor's office, the cotton factor who handled the sales, and potentially 2 members of the Mississippi state legislature who had financial interests in the plantation's declared yield figures. The penalty for what Ezra was doing was not merely death. It was the kind of death designed to be witnessed. It was the kind of death that was meant to establish what happened to men who refused the role assigned to them. He did it 16 times. He never stopped. The Mississippi Department of Archives received the Hargrove Plantation Collection in 1961. 14 boxes, 432 individual documents. The intake log, which still exists, records each item by category, approximate date, and condition. The 16 accounts ledgers appear on page 7 of the intake log under the designation Plantation Financial Records, bound volumes, 1843 to 1859. Good condition, no action required. No action required. The standard intake protocol in 1961 did not include physical examination of binding material. Why would it? Binding material is infrastructure. Binding material holds documents together so that documents can be read. The protocol was designed to assess and preserve what was legible. No one had written a protocol for what might be hidden inside the thing that makes legibility possible. The ledgers sat in climate-controlled storage for 33 years. 33 years. 11 presidential administrations. The entire arc of the Civil Rights Movement, the Voting Rights Act, 2 Gulf Wars. The births and deaths of people who had worked their entire careers in archives, without once being asked to cut open a spine that had already been cataloged and set aside. Margaret Cole was not assigned to those ledgers. She had requested them for a general conservation survey, routine maintenance on aged binding material, exactly the kind of preservation work that keeps documents intact for another century. She had no idea what she was looking for. She wasn't looking for anything. She cut into the spine on a Tuesday afternoon in October 1994 and found the edge of a folded sheet of paper, and she set down her blade, and she unfolded it under the light, and she looked at the numbers for 26 minutes before she called anyone. What she was looking at was evidence. Not metaphorical evidence, not historical interpretation. Evidence. Precise, systematic, internally consistent, cross-referenceable against existing market records of a financial crime that had never been prosecuted because no one had known it existed. Ezra had documented everything. He had hidden everything perfectly. He had survived 16 years in the same room as the crime he was recording, and he had pressed the record flat and put it behind the glue. And he had done this knowing, he thought he had to have known, that his name would not appear on those pages, that the numbers would survive him, that he was building something for a future he would not live inside. He couldn't write his name in letters. He couldn't address what he made to anyone in particular. He pressed it into the spine and waited in the only way available to a man in his position. He left it for whoever cut the right thing open. The Tulane research team completed their initial analysis in February 1995. The report runs to 211 pages. Its central finding is stated in a single sentence on page 4. The third column figures, cross-referenced against contemporaneous Adams County cotton market records and the New Orleans Cotton Exchange, daily weight logs for the period 1843 to 1859, indicate a systematic underreporting of labor and yield across all 16 years of the Hargrove plantation accounts, producing a documented discrepancy equivalent to approximately $4.2 million annually in present value. $4.2 million per year for 16 years. 127 people. 0 wages. 0 legal recourse. 0 possibility of the man who documented the theft ever standing in a courtroom and describing what he had seen, because the courtroom did not recognize him as a person who could stand in one. The Hargrove family still owns 640 acres outside Natchez. The current assessed value is $8.7 million. The descendants of the family, Thomas Hargrove's great-great-grandchildren, have lived on that land for 5 generations. They built houses. They raised children. They applied for county permits and paid property taxes and participated in local civic life in a county where, in 1843, 127 people were building the economic foundation on which all of that became possible. In 2019, a civil claim was filed in Claiborne County Circuit Court. The plaintiffs were a coalition of descendants of formerly enslaved people who could demonstrate documented connection to the Hargrove plantation through Freedmen's Bureau records and post-emancipation census data. The claim rested in part on the Tulane findings. On page 47 of the court filing, among the listed exhibits, is a designation that appears without fanfare between a land survey and a county assessment record. Exhibit 7B. 16 folded documents recovered from plantation accounts ledger spines, 1843 to 1859. Mississippi Department of Archives Acquisition 1961, C014. Ezra's third column is in a court record. His name is not on it. His number system is not yet fully decoded. The case has been in procedural motions for 4 years. And there is something the Tulane team noted in their 1995 report, in a footnote on page 108, that no journalist covering the story has yet reported, and no court filing has yet addressed. The folding sequence Ezra used, the 11 folds, the precise alternating pattern, is not random. A material scientist at LSU ran the geometry in 2021. The sequence is not the most efficient way to compress a sheet of paper to 4 millimeters. It is not the easiest. It is not the fastest. It is the only folding sequence that, when unfolded in a specific order, reveals the pages in chronological sequence. First year on top, last year on the bottom. As if Ezra had designed it to be read by someone who didn't know where to start. He built a reading order into the fold. He designed it to be found. He designed it to be understood. He designed it for a reader he would never meet, in a future he could not see. And he built the instructions into the paper itself, so that the reader would know, without being told, that what they were holding had been made for them. 127 people, 16 years, 11 folds. The court is still in session. The LSU Materials Science Laboratory occupies the 3rd floor of a building that was designed for other purposes and adapted badly, so that the hallways are too narrow and the freight elevator makes a sound on descent that everyone on the floor has learned to ignore. Dr. Anita Prasad works at a bench along the north wall, under fluorescent light, that she has supplemented with 4 adjustable daylight lamps arranged to eliminate shadow at every conceivable angle, because her work is the kind of work where shadow is the enemy and detail is the entire point. In March of 2021, she received 16 folded documents from the Mississippi Department of Archives, transported in an acid-free clamshell box, accompanied by a 3-page request from a law firm in Jackson and a single-line note from Margaret Cole that read, Please look at the folds themselves, not just the content. Prasad looked at the folds. She photographed each document before unfolding. She measured fold angles using digital calipers. She mapped the crease sequence of each of the 16 sheets. The order in which the folds had been made, determined by which crease lines ran continuous and which had been interrupted by subsequent folds. The way a paper archaeologist reads strata. The process took 9 days. On the 10th day, she understood what she was looking at. The 11-fold sequence was not intuitive. It was not the natural result of a person folding a sheet of paper to make it small. A person folding paper without a plan produces a different pattern. Wider primary folds, inconsistent angles, crease asymmetry that reveals improvisation. Ezra's folds were not improvised. Every crease hit the same angle across all 16 documents, measured within 2 degrees of variance. The tolerance of a human hand working from internalized muscle memory rather than a mechanical guide. He had practiced this many times before he ever put a document inside a spine. The sequence he used, 3 horizontal, 2 vertical, 3 horizontal, 2 vertical, 1 horizontal, produces a specific result when reversed. Unfolded in the exact reverse order of creation, the document opens from the most recent entry to the earliest, last year on top. First year, revealed only when the sheet is fully extended. Unfolded in forward order. The intuitive direction, the direction a person would choose if they found a folded document and simply opened it. The sheet reveals itself from first year to last. Chronologically, March 1843 at the top of the first surface. December 1858 at the bottom of the 22nd. He built a reading order into the paper itself. He built it so that the person who found it would read the story from the beginning. He built it so that the beginning was accessible without instructions. He built it understanding with absolute precision that a person who found a folded document and did not know what it was would open it in the intuitive direction and arrive at the start of the story, at the March 1843 entry, at the very first number in the very first hidden column, without being told where to start. Ezra designed a user interface in 1843 for a reader he would never meet. Prasad submitted her report to the law firm in Jackson in April 2021. She used the phrase deliberate information architecture in the abstract. She used the phrase intentional temporal sequencing in the methodology section. In her personal notes, recovered for this documentary with her permission, she wrote something shorter. He knew someone was coming. He built the door so they could open it. The house at Hargrove Plantation no longer stands. It burned in 1876, 12 years after emancipation, in circumstances that were recorded as accidental and disputed by everyone who knew anyone who had been there. What remains is the foundation, Southjo locally quarried limestone, mortared with a mixture that included crushed oyster shell, which gives the remaining walls a faint iridescent quality in afternoon light, as if the stone itself is still reflecting something that happened to it a long time ago. The accounts room was in the northeast corner of the ground floor. The window faced the drive. The desk, walnut, 3 drawers on the right, 1 on the left, key present for the right drawers only, is described in an 1848 estate inventory that still exists in the county records office. Ezra sat at that desk every working day for 16 years. He sat 12 feet from the door that the overseer used. He sat beneath a window that faced the cotton fields in the distance. The fields where 114 of the 127 people on that plantation worked from first light, which in midsummer arrived before 5 in the morning, until the overseer's bell, which in the harvest months did not ring until after dark. He sat with a ledger open in front of him and numbers running through his head, and the absolute certainty, always present, always running underneath the arithmetic, like a secondary bass note in a piece of music, that any knock on the door could be the last one. He kept accurate books anyway, both sets. His official ledger entries are remarkable in their own right. The Tulane forensic accountant who decoded the third column spent considerable time documenting this. The official figures are not sloppy. They are not the work of someone performing competence while hiding incompetence. They are precise, internally consistent, methodologically sound records that would pass scrutiny from any professional contemporary accountant given the tools and categories available in 1843. Thomas Hargrove received genuinely excellent bookkeeping from Ezra. This is not incidental. This is why Ezra survived 16 years in that room. A man who produced inferior work would have been moved to the fields. A man who produced inferior work would have lost his access to the accounts room, the key to the right drawers, the paper supply in the locked cabinet. A man who produced inferior work would not have had 40 unobserved minutes each year with a fresh spine and a folded sheet of paper and the glue setting on the workbench. Ezra's competence was not incidental to his project. It was the foundation of it. He built his evidence on top of his usefulness, and his usefulness protected his evidence, and neither one could have existed without the other. He was brilliant at the job they gave him. He used that brilliance to document the theft they were committing with his hands. The overseer's name was Calvin Marsh. He appears in county records and deed filings in a letter Thomas Hargrove wrote to the Adams County Agricultural Society in 1852, recommending him as a man of reliable industry and firm management. He appears in the plantation's payroll records, paid in cash quarterly at a rate that increased 3 times over the 16 years he worked the Hargrove property. He appears one additional time in the historical record, in a document that nobody connected to Ezra's story until the Tulane research team pulled every available source in 1995. He appears in an 1851 insurance claim. On the 14th of August, 1851, Calvin Marsh filed a damage claim with the Southern Mutual Insurance Company of Georgia for a ledger described as damaged by water, rendered partially illegible, of the account's year 1849. The claim was approved. A replacement was issued. The 1849 ledger in the Hargrove Plantation collection at the Mississippi Department of Archives is not the original 1849 ledger. It is the replacement. The original damaged ledger and the one Marsh filed the claim for was destroyed. Standard procedure for damaged records in that era. The water damage would have required opening the binding to assess the extent of deterioration to the text block. Opening the binding would have exposed the spine. The third column document from 1849 does not exist. Of the 16 years Ezra worked in that room, the record for 1849 is missing. It is the only year missing. The insurance claim was filed 6 weeks after the 1849 ledger, would have been reviewed in the annual accounts check. What happened in August of 1851 is not documented. What happened to Ezra in August of 1851 is not documented. He is listed in the 1850 census as property. He is listed in the 1852 plantation inventory as property. There is a gap of 14 months in which no record references him at all. He kept folding after 1851. The 1852 sheet exists. The 1853 sheet exists. Whatever happened in August of that year, on the other side of that 14-month gap, Ezra came back to the desk and came back to the paper and came back to the fold. He did not stop. The content of the surviving 15 hidden sheets required 18 months to fully decode. The 2-digit numbering system Ezra used for individuals assigned, it appears, in order of age, so that the lowest numbers correspond to the oldest workers, allowed the research team to cross-reference his figures against the 1850 Federal Census Slave Schedule, which recorded enslaved people by age and sex, but not by name. 14 of the 15 documents contain at least one entry that can be matched with a specific individual in the census schedule with high confidence. One individual appears in every surviving document, designated throughout as number 11. Number 11 is described in the 1850 census schedule as male, 42 years of age. In Ezra's system, that places his birth year at approximately 1808. He appears in Ezra's records with an entry that repeats in varying form across every document in which he appears. The forensic accountant's translation reads, Number 11, hours unlogged, consistently between 8 and 12 per week, flagged against field supervisor tallies. 8 to 12 unlogged hours per week, every week, for at least 7 years. For a man whose legal status meant that his labor had a quantifiable market value, the systematic erasure of 8 to 12 hours per week of that labor from the official record represents a deliberate, ongoing act of theft so normalized that the overseer didn't bother to conceal it. Ezra logged every instance, every week, for every person he could verify. He couldn't do anything about it. He couldn't file a complaint, couldn't confront Marsh, couldn't take the ledger to a magistrate, couldn't write a letter to a newspaper. He was not legally permitted to initiate any legal process in the state of Mississippi. He could not stand up from his desk and walk out the door. The only tool available to him was the one he had: arithmetic, patience, and paper. He used all three. The economic analysis carried out by the Tulane team was not the first attempt to quantify the financial dimensions of American plantation slavery. Economists had worked on the question for decades, using aggregate figures, census data, and commodity market records. What the Hargrove documents provided that no previous dataset had offered was granularity at the individual level. Specific people, specific hours, specific weights, specific market prices, documented across 16 continuous years by someone who had stood in the same room as the numbers being manipulated. The lead economist on the Tulane team, Dr. Jerome Washington, describes the discovery in precise terms. Before the third column, the best available methodology for calculating individual labor value on antebellum plantations produced estimates with error ranges of 30 to 40% in either direction. The third column reduced that error range to approximately 4% for the Hargrove plantation specifically, because Ezra had recorded the actual figures alongside the falsified ones. The gap between them was not an estimate, it was a measurement. The resulting numbers are specific in a way that aggregate historical figures are not. Worker number 11, the 42-year-old male, born approximately 1808, unlogged hours consistently between 8 and 12 weekly, generated a documented labor value of approximately $11,400 in present terms per year across 7 documented years. That is $79,800. That is one person. That is 7 years of one person's accounted and unaccounted work. There are 14 individuals the team identified with high confidence across the surviving 15 documents. There are 112 individuals in Ezra's records who cannot yet be cross-referenced to surviving census data. 112 people whose contribution is documented in numbers written by a man who could not write words, folded into a spine, waiting for someone to cut the right thing open. The Hargrove family was informed of the Tulane findings in the spring of 1996. The family's response, documented in a letter from their legal representative to the Mississippi Department of Archives, which is a public record, consisted of 3 sentences. The first sentence acknowledged receipt of the research summary. The second sentence stated that the family had no comment on the findings at this time. The third sentence requested that no communications regarding the matter be directed to the family property. The property in question is the same 640 acres. The family has lived on that land for 5 generations. They have planted crops. They have subdivided portions and sold them. They have built roads and installed utilities and applied for county zoning permits and paid local taxes assessed against the current appraised value of $8.7 million. Every one of those transactions is legal. Every one of those transactions is built on a foundation that Ezra documented, folded, pressed flat, and hid inside the thing that holds everything together. The current generation of the Hargrove family did not enslave anyone. This is true. This is also not the question the court is examining. The question the court is examining is narrower and more specific, and for that reason, more difficult to resolve with the language presently available in American property law. The question is whether land whose value was established through documented, measurable, and now quantified unpaid labor remains subject to any legal claim by the descendants of the people who performed that labor. The question has no settled answer. No appellate court in the United States has ruled on a case with the evidentiary specificity that Exhibit 7B provides. The lawyers on both sides know this. The judge assigned to the case knows this. The case has been in procedural motions for 4 years and has not yet reached trial. Margaret Cole retired from the Mississippi Department of Archives in 2017. She lives in Jackson in a house with a front porch. She is furnished with chairs that belong to her grandmother. When the documentary team interviewed her in September 2024, she was asked what she thought about when she thought about Ezra. She did not answer immediately. She looked at her hands. Then she said that she thought about the 40 minutes. She thought about what it meant to have 40 minutes. Not 40 free minutes, not 40 minutes of authorized time, but 40 minutes of unobserved proximity to the thing you were building and to use every one of them every year, knowing exactly what the cost of a mistake was. She said she thought about the discipline of that, the patience, the absolute refusal to stop. She said she thought about the fact that he never wrote his name on any of it. Not because he didn't have a name, not because he didn't know how important the documents were, because he understood, with the same precision he brought to every number he ever recorded, that his name was not the point. The numbers were the point. The numbers would survive him in a way that his name could not. The numbers were immune to the laws that governed his existence, because numbers are not a language that can be made illegal, and the laws that had been built to erase him had not, in their entirety and specificity, thought to prohibit the notation of a weight in pounds or a count of hours in quarter-day increments. He found the one door they had left open. He walked through it 16 times. The forensic examination of the 16 documents, the physical examination separate from the content analysis, produced one finding that the Tulane team buried in an appendix. It was buried not because anyone considered it unimportant, but because no one knew what to do with it at the time. And by the time anyone understood its implications, the main report had already been delivered to the archives and the law firm and the 3 academic journals that published excerpts. The finding concerns the paper itself. The fine paper stored in the locked cabinet in the Hargrove house accounts room was imported stock, a specific grade of writing paper manufactured in Philadelphia and shipped south through a New Orleans distributor. Records of the distributor's client list survive in the Louisiana State Museum's commercial archives. The Hargrove plantation appears on that list consistently, from 1843 through 1859, ordering 12 sheets of that specific grade per year. The forensic paper analysis of all 15 surviving third-column documents, conducted using fiber composition testing and watermark examination, shows that all 15 were cut from sheets of that Philadelphia manufactured paper. 12 sheets ordered. 1 sheet used per year for the official correspondence visible to Thomas Hargrove. 11 sheets used for accounts work and miscellaneous house administration, also visible and accounted for. The 6th sheet in each annual order, the 6th of 12, was cut, precisely, with a blade that left a straight edge consistent with a carpenter's marking knife rather than scissors. Ezra was not stealing paper. The paper was accounted for. He was using a portion of the paper that he was authorized to use for purposes that fell within the description of his authorized function at a scale small enough, 1 sheet per year, that it produced no discrepancy in the supply records. The paper orders show 12 sheets annually for 16 years. None of the supply inventories show a shortage. The paper was there. He used it. He used exactly as much as he could use without leaving a trace in the records that he himself was responsible for maintaining. He managed his own supply chain. He audited himself. He left no evidence in the ledger that could have exposed the ledger. The precision of this is not incidental. The precision of this is the entire story. In November of 2023, the legal team representing the Plaintiff Coalition filed a supplementary motion requesting that the court authorize a physical examination of the remaining Hargrove plantation collection at the Mississippi Department of Archives. Specifically, the 14 boxes of non-ledger documents cataloged in 1961 that had not been examined as part of the original Tulane research. The motion cited new information. Specifically, the motion cited Dr. Prasad's 2021 findings on the intentional sequencing of the fold, and it cited a question that Prasad had included at the end of her report, a question she had framed as a researcher's note. not a legal finding, because it was outside her area of expertise. The question was this: if Ezra had designed the folding sequence with sufficient precision to encode a reading order, and if he had managed his paper supply with sufficient care to leave no trace in the supply inventory, and if he had maintained his record for 16 years without a single gap in the fold sequence, then the question of whether those 16 ledgers represent the complete archive, or whether additional documents may exist in forms not yet examined, is one that the physical record has not yet resolved. Prasad wrote, "The folding method is consistent across all 15 surviving documents. The consistency suggests the method was standardized from the first year. The first year present in the collection is 1843. The plantation accounts for years prior to 1843 are not included in the 1961 acquisition. The provenance documentation for the 1961 acquisition notes that the collection was transferred from the estate of a Hargrove family descendant and that the family retained certain documents at the time of transfer. The family retained certain documents. The court authorized the supplementary examination in February 2024. The 14 boxes were opened. The examination team, 2 archivists, 1 forensic document specialist, 1 materials scientist, spent 3 days working through the contents. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, inside a manila folder cataloged as Miscellaneous Plantation Correspondence, undated, the document specialist found something that had not been part of any inventory. A ledger. Small. Bound differently from the 16 accounts ledgers. Tighter, narrower, using a different adhesive and a different thread. Not a standard plantation accounts book. Something made by hand to a custom dimension from materials consistent with those available in the Hargrove house accounts room. The spine was intact. The specialist did not cut it open. She photographed it. She placed it back in the acid-free box. She called the lead attorney for the plaintiff coalition, and then she called Margaret Cole, and then she sat in the examination room for a long time looking at the thing on the table. It should not exist. The account's record for the Hargrove plantation begins in 1843. That is what the collection indicates, what the 1961 intake log records. What every researcher who has touched this material has assumed since the day Margaret Cole cut open volume 212 and sat down on the floor. The ledger in the manila folder is dated 1837. Ezra had been there before 1843. He had been there 6 years, before the earliest document in the official collection. He had been folding before anyone thought to look. The spine has not yet been opened. The examination room at the Mississippi Department of Archives has 2 windows, both of which face an interior courtyard, so that the light arriving through them at any hour of the day has already bounced off a painted concrete wall and arrived softened and indirect and without a strong directional quality, which is precisely the kind of light preferred for documentary examination, because it does not create the shadows that hide detail at the edges of aged paper. On a Tuesday morning in February 2024, the small ledger sat on the examination table inside a clamshell box lined with archival tissue, and 3 people stood around it without touching it for approximately 4 minutes before anyone spoke. The ledger was smaller than expected. That was the first thing the document specialist noted. Smaller than the 16 official accounts books, smaller than the standard plantation ledger format, bound in a plain brown cover with no embossing and no label on the spine. The stitching along the spine was visible, a heavier thread than standard, pulled tight in a pattern that a bookbinder would recognize as a Coptic stitch, which is a style that produces a book that opens flat and stays open flat under the weight of a hand pressed against the page. It was built to be written in, quickly, both hands occupied. The date on the inside front cover was not printed or embossed. It was written in ink, in the same controlled numeral hand that appeared across the 15 surviving third column documents. Not a word, not a month name written in letters, only the year in 4 numerals at the top center of the first page. Nobody in the research community had looked for Ezra before 1843. This is not a failure of scholarship. It is a failure of assumption. The assumption, reasonable, defensible, consistent with the available evidence up to February 2024, was that the Hargrove plantation accounts collection represented the complete surviving record of Ezra's presence in the historical archive. The 1961 intake log listed 16 accounts ledgers. The research team had found 15 third column documents. The one missing year, 1849, was explained by the insurance claim. The system was self-contained and internally consistent, and nobody had asked whether the system had a starting point before 1843, because nobody had asked where Ezra was before Thomas Hargrove sat him at that desk. That question had an answer. It took 6 weeks to find it. The search for records predating the Hargrove collection required working backward through every document class that might contain a reference to a person designated by a function rather than a name. Tax records, estate inventories, bill of sale registers, insurance assessments. The domestic slave trade of the American South in the 1830s generated an enormous volume of transaction paperwork. More than most people realize, because the trade was not informal, it was commercial, and commercial transactions required documentation for the same reasons that all commerce requires documentation, which is that money changes hands and money requires a paper trail. The trail for Ezra began in Richmond, Virginia. Not a certain trail, not a document that says Ezra, house accounts, and lists a transfer date and a price and a receiving party. The domestic slave trade did not work that way. What survives in the Richmond records is a series of interlocking references across 3 document classes: a sale ledger from a Franklin and Armfield trading house satellite operation, an 1836 estate inventory from a tobacco processing facility in Henrico County, and a single letter from a Mississippi land agent to a Virginia estate executor that, taken together, describe the transfer of a person identified across all 3 documents only by function. In the sale ledger, accounts figure, male, approximately 25 years, no defects. In the estate inventory, figures man, house, not to be separated from records. In the letter, the figure keeper Hargrove requires can be sourced from the Henrico estate currently in probate. Approximately 25 years old in 1836. Born, therefore, approximately 1811. The Henrico County tobacco facility where he had worked before the sale had been processing leaf and maintaining production accounts since at least 1829. He would have been approximately 18 years old when he began. He had started with numbers 18 years before Calvin Marsh reviewed a plantation ledger and felt nothing unusual under his hand. He had been doing this for a long time before Natchez. The tobacco facility records from Henrico County are partially intact at the Library of Virginia. They are not a complete archive. Fires, floods, and the deliberate destruction of plantation records during and after the Civil War have created gaps across almost every collection of this type. What survives is approximately 60% of the production accounts from 1829 to 1836, maintained in a style that the Library of Virginia's catalog describes as unusually consistent in format and notation, suggesting a single accountant working across the full period. A single accountant working from approximately 1829. Consistent format. Consistent notation. The forensic accountant from the Tulane team, Dr. Clarence Webb, who had spent 18 months decoding Ezra's third column shorthand, examined digital photographs of the Henrico facility production accounts in March 2024. His assessment, provided in a letter to the plaintiff's legal team, required 2 paragraphs to establish context and 1 sentence to deliver its finding. The sentence reads, "The numeral formation and shorthand notation in the Henrico County Tobacco Facility records from 1829 to 1836 are consistent with the same hand responsible for the Hargrove Plantation official accounts and third column documents from 1843 to 1858. Same hand. 7 years in Virginia, 16 years in Mississippi, 23 years of documented continuous accounting work by a person the historical record describes in its most expansive moment as serviceable. He was not serviceable. He was the most prolific hidden documentarian in the antebellum South, and he had started before he was 20 years old, and nobody knew it because nobody had thought to look at the facility records in Richmond with the same question they had brought to the ledgers in Natchez. The question was, what else did he hide? The Henrico facility records do not show evidence of a third column technique. Webb's examination found no hidden documents in the surviving bound volumes. Those bindings had been reglued at least twice during their time in the Library of Virginia's holdings, and any insertions would have been lost. But the production accounts themselves contained something that a standard audit would not flag, and that Webb identified only because he already knew what Ezra's notation system looked like at its maturity. Margin marks. Small, precise. Written in the same ink as surrounding entries and at the same pen pressure. So they registered as ordinary annotation rather than as a separate layer of notation. 3 types of mark. A vertical stroke, a diagonal stroke, and a small circle, appearing in the margins of specific entries across the production accounts for 1831 through 1835. Webb spent 3 weeks mapping the marks. The vertical stroke, he determined, appears consistently in the margin of entries where the recorded weight of processed tobacco leaf is lower than what the raw input figures would predict given standard processing yield ratios. The diagonal stroke appears in the margin of entries where labor hours logged are inconsistent with production output. The small circle appears in entries where the figures cannot be verified against any external data point. Entries that exist, in other words, only because someone wrote them with no independent corroboration. He was marking errors, he was marking falsifications, he was marking the gaps between what the record claimed and what the record read carefully against itself could not support. He was 18 years old. He hadn't yet developed the fold. He did not yet have the paper access or the binding time or the physical privacy to produce a parallel document. So he did the only thing available to him at 18. working in a facility where every minute of his presence was visible to someone. He left marks, small enough to survive, specific enough to mean something, invisible unless you already knew what to look for. He had been building a language. The third column was not the beginning. The third column was the version he finished. The plaintiff coalition in the Claiborne County case is composed of 43 individuals. They range in age from 22 to 81. Their connection to the Hargrove plantation is documented through Freedmen's Bureau records, post-emancipation census filings, and in several cases through privately held family documents, letters, photographs, and in 2 instances, oral history recordings made in the 1970s by a graduate student at Jackson State University who was conducting field work on plantation descendant communities in Adams County. They do not all know each other. They have not all met. Several of them learned of the legal case through a community newsletter distributed in 2019 and joined the coalition without previously knowing that a plantation called Hargrove had any connection to their family history. One of them is a retired accountant. Her name is Dolores Marsh, no relation to Calvin Marsh, the overseer, a coincidence of surname that she acknowledges with the flat expression of a person who has had this noted to her many times. She is 73 years old. She worked for 31 years as a certified public accountant for a firm in Memphis, Tennessee. She specialized in estate accounting. When she read the Tulane report in the summer of 2019, she read it the way she reads any financial document, for method first, content second. She called the plaintiff legal team 3 days later. She told them she wanted to join the coalition. She also told them something that no one had yet described in those terms. She said that what Ezra had built was not just a record, it was a forensic audit. It was conducted using the correct methodology for detecting systematic falsification in double-entry bookkeeping. And it was conducted by someone who had arrived at that methodology without access to any formal training, any professional text, or any colleague who could confirm that his approach was sound. He had invented the technique himself. The same technique that was formalized in American accounting education in the 1920s, 80 years after Ezra began applying it in the Henrico facility, was sitting in those ledger spines waiting for someone who knew what they were looking at. Dolores Marsh knew what she was looking at. She joined the coalition. She also volunteered to assist the forensic team. Dr. Webb later described her contribution as clarifying in ways that took weeks off the analysis. The small 1837 ledger was opened on a Wednesday morning, 11 days after it was found. The delay was procedural. Preservation protocol required humidity stabilization before any physical examination of the binding, and the document specialist insisted on completing that process before anyone touched the spine. The spine cut took 40 seconds. Standard procedure, same blade, same angle that Margaret Cole had used 30 years earlier. The cover board separated. The specialist inserted the spatula along the inner hinge. She felt nothing unusual. The spine was empty, not damaged. Not empty because of deterioration or previous examination. Empty in the precise sense. The channel held binding cloth, standard packing material, no paper insertion. The document had not been used the same way. No third column, no hidden sheet, no 11-fold document pressed flat against the leather. The team stood around the table for a moment without speaking. Then the document specialist opened the ledger to the first page. The first page is not a column of numbers. It is the only page in any document connected to Ezra that contains anything other than figures. It contains 11 lines. The first 7 lines are numerical, densely notated in the third column shorthand that Webb had decoded, recording production figures from the Henrico facility dated between January and August of 1837. The figures cover the period between the estate inventory that listed him as Figures Man House and the bill of sale that transferred him to the Franklin and Armfield operation for the journey south. He was documenting the theft right up until they sold him. Line 8 is a blank line. Lines 9, 10, and 11 are different. They are not numbers. They are letters. Not the fluid, practiced hand of a person who has written in letters his whole life, but the labored, careful, precisely constructed letters of someone who has taught himself to form them one at a time, each character built from its component strokes, as if assembled rather than written, the way a person does when they have learned from observation rather than instruction. 3 lines. 11 words in total. The first line contains 1 word. It is a name. The second line contains 4 words. They describe, in plain and functional terms, what the numbers in the first 7 lines document. The third line contains 6 words. The document specialist read the third line. She read it twice. She looked at the 2 archivists across the table. Then she looked at the name on the first line, the name he had written in the letters he had taught himself in secret, the letters that were illegal, the letters he had learned anyway, the letters with which he had signed what he built, and she understood what she was holding. The third line, translated from the labored but legible construction of a self-taught hand, reads, "I made this. Someone will read it. His name is on the first line. It is not Ezra." The name on the first line of the 1837 ledger is written in 3 parts. A given name, a middle name, and a surname, which is the first piece of information that stopped everyone in the room. Because enslaved people in the American South did not have legal surnames, were not permitted legal surnames, were not recorded with surnames in any official document, were listed in census schedules and estate inventories and bill of sale registers as single names at most, often as no name at all, often as a function, a designation, a line in a column that described what a person could do rather than who a person was. He gave himself 3 names. He wrote them in letters he taught himself without a teacher, in a ledger he built by hand, with ink and a pen that belonged to a facility that did not legally recognize his right to hold either. The name is Solomon Pemberton Ward. Solomon Adesadzaz, a name that required no explanation to anyone who had access to a Bible, which in the antebellum South meant everyone, including the men who used Scripture to justify what they were doing to him. Solomon, whose defining attribute in the text is not power or conquest, but the specific capacity to see truth beneath concealment, to look at 2 claims on the same thing and know with certainty which one was real. Pemberton, and not a surname from any slaveholder's family connected to his documented history, not a name that appears in the bill of sale, in the estate inventory, in any plantation register. A name chosen apparently from somewhere else, from some other source of meaning. The search for the origin of that name took 4 months. Ward, a word before it was a surname. Ward, a keeper, a guardian, A person assigned to watch over something that requires protection. He named himself the Keeper in 1837, before anyone was looking. The name changed everything, and it changed everything slowly, the way that significant things usually change. Not in a single moment of revelation, but across weeks of increasingly precise archival work. Each new document a slightly clearer resolution on a picture that had been blurry for 187 years. The research team understood within 48 hours that a three-part name, even a self-assigned one, was a searchable quantity in a way that Ezra house accounts was not. A name has specificity. A name can be cross-referenced. A name written by the same hand that had produced 23 years of documented account records could be compared for authenticity against those records and declared consistent, which Dr. Webb did in writing on the third day after the opening. Solomon Pemberton Ward. Consistent with all previously examined documents from the hand designated in the Tulane research as the accounts figure. The Henrico County records came first. The tobacco facility records at the Library of Virginia contained, in a box that had not been cataloged below the folder level, a set of employee-adjacent documents. Not payroll records, because the enslaved workers did not receive pay, but what the facility called a hand register, a list of all people working the property at a given time, updated annually, kept for insurance valuation purposes. The 1834 hand register lists, on line 47 of 62 entries. Solomon figures approximately 23 years, Pemberton origin. Pemberton origin. Not a chosen name, a place. Pemberton was a tobacco estate in Goochland County, Virginia, 12 miles west of Richmond. Solomon had been born there, or had been held there long enough that the facility used the estate name as his identifier. A common practice when a person had been transferred multiple times and the receiving facility needed a shorthand for provenance. The Pemberton estate records at the Virginia Historical Society are partial. Fire took a portion. Deliberate destruction took more. What survives includes an 1815 birth register, a document the estate kept for insurance purposes, listing enslaved infants born on the property, with approximate dates and the names assigned to them by the estate. Line 31 of the 1815 register. Male infant, born spring season. Mother. Hannah, assigned name Samuel. Spring 1815. Approximately 23 years old in 1838, which matches the Henrico hand register entry. Mother named Hannah. Assigned name Samuel, not Solomon. He had changed his own name. He had taken the name assigned to him by an estate that treated him as property and replaced it with a name that he chose with full understanding of what the name meant, and he had written the chosen name in letters he taught himself and placed it at the top of a document built to survive him. He renamed himself in the same document where he signed his work. Hannah appears in the Pemberton estate records 3 additional times. She is listed in the 1810 hand register, which means she was already on the property before Solomon was born, and in the 1818 and 1822 updates. She does not appear in the 1827 update. She would have been somewhere between 30 and 40 years old in 1827. The reason for her disappearance from the record is not documented. The possibilities are the same possibilities that explain every disappearance of an enslaved woman from antebellum plantation records, and none of them are benign. Solomon, still Samuel in those years, still carrying the name they had given him, would have been approximately 12 years old in 1827. He started making margin marks in the Henrico facility accounts in 1831. He was approximately 16. Whatever happened in 1827 did not stop him from learning the numbers. Whatever happened to Hannah did not stop him from watching and recording and building the language he would spend the next 23 years perfecting. The research team did not document this connection as causal. Historians are trained to avoid causal claims without supporting evidence, and there is no document that explains why Solomon Pemberton Ward began building a hidden record of stolen labor at the age of 16. There is only the fact that he did, and there is only the fact that the year he started could be placed, with reasonable confidence, at approximately the same distance from his mother's disappearance from the record as a person's grief takes to harden into something more durable than grief, something more useful, something that can be folded 11 times and pressed behind glue and made to outlast every person who ever tried to erase the person who made it. The Freedmen's Bureau records are the most comprehensive archive of formerly enslaved people in American history. They are incomplete. The Bureau operated for only 7 years, was chronically underfunded, and was ultimately dismantled by a Congress that preferred to move on. But within their incompleteness, they contain more individual-level documentation of Black life in the immediate post-emancipation period than any other surviving source. The Bureau's Mississippi Field Office records, held at the National Archives in Washington, include registration files for approximately 41,000 individuals who registered in the state between 1865 and 1869. Registration number 7,834 in the Adams County Field Office files is a single page, handwritten by a bureau clerk, recording the registration of a formerly enslaved man on October 14th, 1865. The clerk's handwriting is standard period script. The entry records name, approximate age, former place of residence, and immediately prior enslaver. Name, Solomon Ward. Age, approximately 54. Former residence, Hargrove Plantation, Adams County. Former enslaver, Thomas Hargrove, deceased. He survived. He was 54 years old. He had survived 38 years of what the historical record shows him to have been doing. And he had walked into a Freedmen's Bureau field office in the October of 1865 and registered under the name he had given himself in 1837, in a ledger he had built by hand, in letters nobody had taught him. He did not use Samuel, he did not use Ezra, he used Solomon Ward. And no clerk questioned it because formerly enslaved people registering with the Bureau were permitted to choose their own names. Finally, legally, with the force of the federal government behind the permission, and Solomon Pemberton Ward had already made his choice 28 years before the law caught up to it. The registration file contains one additional entry in a column headed Family Members Known or Located. It contains one name, a daughter, listed as Ruth Ward, age approximately 14, location, Adams County. Ruth Ward is not a distant figure in this story. She is 3 generations from living people. The genealogical work required to trace Ruth Ward's line forward from 1865 took the research team 6 weeks and involved cross-referencing Freedmen's Bureau records, post-emancipation census schedules from 1870 through 1910, Mississippi County birth and death registers, church membership rolls from 3 Adams County Baptist congregations, and a private family Bible, which a woman named Carolyn Moore discovered in her grandmother's attic in Natchez in 1989, and which she had carried with her, without fully understanding its significance, for 35 years. Carolyn Moore is 58 years old. She works in hospital administration in Jackson, Mississippi. She was not a member of the Plaintiff Coalition in 2019. She had never heard of the Hargrove plantation case. She learned about it in November 2023 through a social media post shared by a cousin she had not spoken to in 4 years, and she read the post on her phone during a lunch break, and she sat very still for a moment, and then she went to get the Bible. The Bible belonged to Ruth Ward. It passed to Ruth's daughter, then to a granddaughter, then through 4 more generations of women who kept it without always knowing precisely why, only knowing that it was old and that it had belonged to someone important and that it was to be kept. Inside the front cover, written in a hand that Dr. Webb confirmed in February 2024 as consistent with the account's figures' documented writing, the same controlled numeral formation, the same pen pressure, the same deliberate construction, is a single line. Not numbers, letters. Ruth, you are the proof that I was here. He wrote it to his daughter. He wrote it in the letters he had taught himself in secret in a building where the teaching of letters to people like him was a criminal act. He wrote it sometime after 1865, after emancipation, when he was no longer required to fold the evidence small. He wrote it in plain sight. The legal implications of finding Ruth Ward's Bible took the plaintiff legal team approximately 2 weeks to fully assess. The assessment was not complicated. It was simply significant in ways that required careful documentation before anyone acted on the implications. Solomon Pemberton Ward is now a named individual with a traceable family line, multiple corroborating documents establishing identity and presence, and a forensic quality connection to 23 years of hidden financial records, documenting the systematic theft of his labor and the labor of 126 other people on land currently in litigation. Prior to November 2023, the third column documents were extraordinary evidence of a pattern of financial crime, but they were evidence produced by a person who existed in the record only as a function. Ezra, house accounts, a designation, an instrument. Solomon Pemberton Ward is a person. He has a mother named Hannah. He has a daughter named Ruth. He has living descendants who carry a Bible he inscribed. He has a registration file at the National Archives. He has a name he chose himself, written in letters he taught himself, placed at the top of a document he built to be found, which is now Exhibit 7C in a civil action in Claiborne County Circuit Court. The Hargrove family's legal team filed a motion to exclude Exhibit 7C from the record on grounds of authentication. The motion cited the age of the document, the unverified provenance, and what the filing described as the impossibility of establishing chain of custody for a document allegedly hidden inside a binding for 187 years. Judge Patricia Weston denied the motion in full. Her written ruling, issued in March 2024, is 14 pages. Page 11 contains a passage that the plaintiff legal team has described in various interviews as the moment when they understood the case had changed. The passage addresses the authentication question directly. It reads, in part, "The court notes that the document in question was found inside a collection held in continuous institutional custody since 1961, inside a binding that the preponderance of forensic evidence indicates had not been previously opened. The question of chain of custody is, in the court's assessment, answered by the document's location. The man who made it put it there. It was there when it was found. The court finds no basis for exclusion. The man who made it put it there." Solomon Pemberton Ward had maintained chain of custody for 187 years by the only method available to him. He built the thing soundly enough that it did not need anyone to guard it. The Mississippi Department of Archives conducted an internal procedural review in January 2024, following the discovery of the 1837 ledger in UN cataloged material from the 1961 acquisition. The review was not punitive. The archivist who oversaw the 1961 intake followed the standard protocol of that era and cannot reasonably be held responsible for not knowing that the standard protocol of that era was insufficient for the specific material in front of him. The review was corrective. The new protocol implemented in March 2024 requires physical examination of all binding material in any plantation origin collection acquired prior to 1990, using non-destructive imaging techniques before any physical spine opening. The protocol is named, in the internal procedural document, after the catalog number of the 1961 Hargrove collection. It is also named in an informal designation that the archive staff use among themselves and that the director acknowledged in a public statement after the man whose work created the need for it. The Ward Protocol. Dolores Marsh attended the first day of trial proceedings in Claiborne County in September 2024. She sat in the gallery in the third row in a gray blazer with a legal pad on her knee. Carolyn Moore sat 2 seats to her left with the Bible in a protective case on her lap. They had met for the first time 4 months earlier at a meeting of the Plaintiff Coalition and had discovered within 15 minutes of conversation that they approached the same subject from 2 different angles that produced, together, a clearer picture than either had managed alone. Dolores understood what Solomon had built. Carolyn carried what Solomon had left. The case is not resolved. Civil proceedings in property and restitution, matters of this complexity, move at the pace of the law, which is not the pace of justice and is not the pace of history. And anyone who tells you otherwise has not spent time in a courthouse gallery watching procedural motions accumulate. The trial is ongoing. The outcome is not predetermined. The Hargrove family's legal team is competent, and the defense arguments regarding current property law are not frivolous, and the judge has not telegraphed a ruling in either direction. But something has already been resolved. And it was resolved not in September 20 to 24, not in February 20 to 24, when the spine of the 1837 ledger was opened, not in October 1994 when Margaret Cole sat down on the floor of the conservation room. It was resolved on a day in 1837 in a building in Henrico County, Virginia, when a man who had been renamed by people who owned him picked up a pen and wrote over their designation with his own and signed the work he had built with the name he had chosen for himself and placed it where the glue would hold and the leather would last and the weight of everything that came after would press it flat and preserve it and keep it intact for the reader he knew was coming. He could not have known when. He could not have known who. He knew someone was coming. He built the door. He designed the opening sequence. He wrote the first line so it would be found first. The reader came. She sat down on the floor and didn't call anyone for 26 minutes. In the conservation room at the Mississippi Department of Archives, there is a light table along the north wall. It is the same light table where Margaret Cole unfolded the first third-column document in October 1994. The table has been replaced once since then. The original fluorescent tube array was upgraded to LED panels in 2011, but the table occupies the same position under the same window that faces the interior courtyard, receiving the same indirect, directionless light. In November 2024, the documentary team was permitted access to the conservation room for a single filming session. The session lasted 4 hours. At the end of the session, with permission from the Mississippi Department of Archives and under the supervision of 2 conservators, a member of the team placed a reproduction of the 1837 ledger on the light table. The original is now in a climate-controlled case in the secure storage facility, and opened it to the first page. The letters hold. The ink has not faded in the way that iron gall inks sometimes fade, going brown and thin and difficult to read under anything less than optimal light. It holds dark and defined and present, each letter built from its component strokes, each stroke the product of a hand that learned without being taught and practiced, without being permitted and produced. At the end of all the practicing, something that has outlasted the law that made it illegal, the building it was made in, the man who tried to value it without knowing its content, and every official document that failed across 187 years to record the name of the person who produced it. The first line reads, Solomon Pemberton Ward. The third line reads, I made this. Someone will read it. Both statements are accurate. Both have always been accurate. The accuracy of the first statement was not altered by the fact that no one knew it for 187 years. The accuracy of the second statement was not contingent on anyone reading it yet. He wrote them as facts. They were facts. Settles the question of what his 23 years of careful watching is worth in present dollars on 640 acres outside Natchez. The spine held. The fold held. The name held. Solomon Pemberton Ward built it to last. It lasted.